important, and that's behind the Darwinian evolution, survival of the fittest. Although probably sociological systems adopt that, and there's a lot of interesting literature. Matt Ridley has written books about this, how economy and finance and everything is like that too. So in a way, these are living systems.
So what I was going to say.
The same?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of something else.
Different opinion?
The ability to reproduce.
Yes, replication. And there is an area of science called artificial life, which is basically computer-generated life, which has also replication, but there's something missing there.
Like cognitive ability?
Consciousness? I would agree with that. I would say, and it's there's also a debate whether consciousness can exist without life, or whether life can exist without consciousness. I think there are people, of course, who are alive and they lost consciousness, and you can do it with anesthesia. So there is a little bit of a gray zone, but in general, I would agree with you that consciousness or some sort of cognitive perception, ability to respond, but yeah. There's one more thing.
I was going to say reproduce as well, but I guess on the other hand, like self-repair as well.
Yeah, and actually there is a whole term for that, anti-fragility, which means that living systems as opposed to physical or engineering systems under stress or wear and tear improve because they learn how to deal with new environmental challenges, right?
Mm-hmm.
And engineering system just degrade, pretty much. I mean, there are some I just on the way here, I saw a car with a Ming something paint, self-repairing paint on the car. But I think it's a far cry from let's say, a human who improves either physically by, climbing a mountain or swimming under harsh conditions and so on. So yes, I agree. There's one more thing I want to add to it, and that is metabolism. And that brings us back to the question of energy, right? We have to metabolize, we have to consume energy and transduce it and use it to live. If you stop metabolism, well, life stops. Physical systems don't need it. In fact, this is the non-equilibrium situation. They would, when you turn off the energy supply, they will just decay down to the ground state, as we call it in physics, or according to Boltzmann, all physical systems left alone go to the maximum entropy state. Maximum entropy means the highest amount of disorder. So that's again speaking to this fragility or degradation of if you put a structure together. I don't know if you sometimes leave your apartment for 2 weeks, you go on vacation, nobody's there, you come back and there's a lot of mess there, right? There's dust everywhere, and suddenly you have to do the cleaning after 2 weeks. Because left to their own devices, physical systems tend to produce disorder. Biological systems actively oppose disorder. They produce order. And that was actually the theme in Schrödinger's book. How do they do it? And that actually somebody mentioned repair, replication. All of this is replication as well as repair is against entropy production. It's producing order out of disorder, not the opposite. Okay, so just to finish the story of physicist Feynman, who was mentioned before, Nobel Prize winner from Caltech, he predicted many years before nanotechnology became all the rage, he predicted the development of nanotechnology, and actually he took cues from biology, because biology is about putting nanostructures together bit by bit, and now we're trying to reproduce it in a way. And somebody said that Mother Nature is a nanotechnology master. And at the nanoscale, things are quantum. So that again gives an argument for quantum interactions in biological systems. Okay, so these are the gifts of quantum mechanics to nature. If nature accepted the gift, which I will try to argue that it did, and actually it's not a big stretch to believe it did. And I didn't have time to talk about this, but these are the weird quantum effects. There are also not so weird effects like, statistics. It wasn't that weird. It was just a bit different, but not a big deal. So we mentioned briefly stability of electrons and atoms. If not for the quantum nature of physical interactions, at least at the microscopic level, we wouldn't have atoms because electrons and protons would simply cancel each other and irradiate the energy. But they don't. They form stable atoms. Then there is the aspect of incredible complexity of quantum systems, which comes out of symmetry and simplicity. Anybody who's done quantum chemistry, I sometimes serve on PhD committees in chemistry, and I'm amazed how complex and stereochemistry with all the molecular orbitals, how that conspires to build molecules of beautiful symmetry. And these are real weird things. Entanglement. So these are what Einstein mentioned as spooky action at the distance. That means in quantum mechanics, two particles can be forever entangled even if they don't interact because of the conservation principle. So for example, if you bring two electrons, spin up and spin down together at one point, and then you release them and let them separate at an arbitrary distance, assuming it's in vacuum that you don't interfere with this process, they will be connected forever and at an arbitrary distance. So there is no interaction because all physical interactions drop with distance. And that has been demonstrated without a doubt that this entanglement, so you measure one particle's spin and the other instantaneously announces to the world its own opposite spin as if they were connected forever. So that entanglement is strange, but maybe there is also some aspect of it. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but you can think of some personal or anecdotal evidence of being entangled with somebody, or perceiving some events which are physically impossible to know, either in the future or some far distance from you. There's a lot of reports of people sensing. Typically, it's tragic events or catastrophic events that occur simultaneously, but far away. It's impossible to have a signal that connects. Animals also sense things like tsunami or earthquakes and so on. So there is something weird in quantum mechanics that maybe is not so weird if you try to explain otherwise unexplainable things, premonitions and so on. But I'll leave it at this just to let you explore some of these quirky aspects on your own. So quantum information, now we're getting into this era of quantum information. Very briefly, the difference between classical information and quantum information is quite profound. In classical computers, as you know, it's 0, 1, right? The code is based on zeros and ones. So in terms of electronics, the current is flowing or not flowing, or you encode a 0 or 1 number in the memory, and that's it. And then you can write all the other numbers in this binary code, or letters, images, everything that we can think of can be transformed into a string of zeros and ones, right? That's classical computing. And then you come up with interactions between two binary strings. Could be addition, multiplication, exclusion, gates, etc. All of this has been developed very, very systematically. So that's easy. Quantum is different because in quantum, nothing is precise. Nothing is 0 or 1. But the major unit of encoding in quantum computer is a qubit. A qubit is basically, well, if this was my 0 and 1, so 1, 0, let's say, right, in classical, and a qubit would be a circle, because this can have a projection anywhere. in a complex plane. So it becomes a unit vector in a plane. So now you can see that instead of two possibilities, you have an infinity, because every projection, every angle, and there's an infinity of angles out of 360 degrees, but depending how thinly you slice it, right? You can have an infinity of an infinite amount of information in this single thing. And then you introduce interaction rules between these qubits. So that adds the incredible amount of complexity to what you can do. And the problem, of course, is to keep it away from interference with other things. In classical computing is quite robust, and quantum is a bit more fragile. You have to shield it from thermal noise and basically disruptions.
So how many qubits are in typical quantum?
Oh, for now, I think the best is something like 17 qubits, very small number, but each of them is very powerful. So you can do a huge number of operations or a huge number of information storage in a small number of qubits. But I don't know if you have anybody speaking about quantum computing in this course.
We did quantum supremacy.
Oh yes,
yeah,
that's related to it.
yeah.
So that's a gift of quantum mechanics. If biological systems with quantum computing, they can be very powerful. And next week, if we get to meet here, otherwise it'll be via teleconferencing. I'll say a few things about that, how this can be implemented in the context of our brains, whether our brains can actually utilize quantum computing. And I would say that there is great amount of support for this idea, in my opinion. All right, so we talked about quantum physics, and another weird thing is tunneling. So in classical mechanics, for example, think about throwing a tennis ball, and there's I don't know if you play tennis, but typically there's a fence, right? There's a fence, and the court is fenced off, and you're inside, and you either, if you really hit it hard, it'll go over the fence on the other side, but it has to be a lot of energy, right? Otherwise, it stays within the court, within the confines of the fence. Well, in classical, that's the case, but in quantum, the tennis ball could tunnel through the fence, even if it doesn't have enough energy. So you hit the fence, and there is a finite probability that this ball will dissipate on the other side. Kind of ghost-like thing. So that's a nature of quantum systems. They can tunnel through so-called potential barriers. In other words, walls. And it's not fiction. It is taking place, and some enzymatic reactions are catalyzed in a quantum sense. So their probabilities are enhanced, although strictly speaking, there wouldn't be classical probability of doing this. The same takes place in semiconducting systems. All right, and then very briefly, just to boast a little bit that all of this quantum stuff entered into modern technology with all the consumer electronics, computers, cell phones, laser scanners, and spectroscopy, MRI, NMR, atomic clocks, and X-rays, and solar batteries, photosensors, photodetectors, PET scans, etc. Okay, so now we have to zoom out because we zoomed in and quantum physics, it's zooming in, we get it, it's great, everything is fine, more or less. But these are the dimensions. We go to 10 to the minus 18 meters. Now if we zoom out, we talk about quantum chemistry, maybe up to 1,000 atoms. That's kind of stretching. I think recently, in fact this year, or maybe last, there was a paper which demonstrated a quantum wave function, so this cloud, for the largest so far molecule ever measured this way. And that molecule was not so small, 25 kilodaltons. 1 dalton is 1 hydrogen atom. mass of one hydrogen atom. So 25,000 hydrogen masses. That was a small protein. I don't remember the name, you can look it up. And that was shown to be quantum. So if a single mid-sized protein, smallish, mid-size would be 50 kilodaltons. 25 is a bit smaller than average. But not really tiny. If a protein can exist in a quantum state, demonstrably, then you can imagine that building proteins, and sometimes you can wonder about the efficiency of biochemical reactions or cell biology inside the cell, things happening so precisely, like in a Swiss watch. Molecules find their partners, build complexes, recognize damage to the DNA, for example, rush to the site, repair the damage. Who the hell is giving the orders, and who is listening? So this is actually quite marvelous. And if you had quantum wave function, this is one aspect of quantum search algorithms, because in classical systems it's either serial or you can have parallel search parties going and searching, but in quantum systems the wave function propagates everywhere. You can instantaneously exploit the entire space. So that could be an immediate success story for application to cell biology. How these reactions occur at the rate they occur in the places and at times that they should, without any conductor directing this orchestra, to my knowledge. Right. All right, but as far as we know, so this is quantum chemistry. Now, as I said, 1,000 atoms is, 25,000 hydrogen masses has been demonstrably proven to be supporting a quantum wave function. Beyond that, it's mesoscale. That's the last round of quantum biology. We're just scratching the surface, and beyond that, we are using mechanics and thermodynamics. That gives you, this table gives you some sort of sense of dimensions, but I don't want to. Just to give you comparison, the smallest cell is an E. coli bacterium, right? E. coli is the size of about 1 micrometer. Viruses, now speaking of viruses, are even smaller, 200 nanometers. So these are nanomachines, really beastly, maybe operate at the quantum level. So we are here at the cells would be in the micrometer to maybe tens of micrometers, and what we typically consider to be quantum would be angstroms, or fractions of a nanometer to a nanometer. So that's the, and I mentioned to you so this is the scale of biological systems. That's one of the challenges when we talk about biology as opposed to physics. In biology, we have not only an incredible number of orders of magnitude involved in physical scales, time scales, as you'll see in the next slide, as well as energy scales. That's a big challenge. In physics, we typically slice it and dice it and operate on a small scale. But here we have, so fraction of an angstrom would be sizes of protons, or these are the smallest grains that you can basically consider in the formation of biological systems. Then we have angstroms for this bond, chemical bond. Then the nano world that we are so obsessed now with, nanometers to 100 nanometers. These are the scales of cellular structures. Thickness of the membrane, 5 nanometers. Size of microtubules, we'll talk a lot about next week. 25 nanometer diameter, a few microns long. Actin filaments, motor proteins, a few nanometers. So all of the machinery of life is in this nano world, which again is sort of the boundary of quantum as far as we know. But of course, we all go all the way to 10 meters, elephants and so on, large mammals. And this slide also indicates to you our probes, because we probe the universe with different techniques. And depending on the range of sizes, you use different probes, from X-rays to ultraviolet to microwave or electron microscopy, light microscopy. And so light, I mentioned 400 to 750 nanometers wavelength, so submicron. And then microscopy, visible. All right, this is the time scales, and this is a big disconnect in terms of what we can do computationally to mimic or to understand biological systems using computational simulations, and the actual time scales in biology. So chemical, this is the fastest. Chemical bond vibrations, like OH or COO or some such bond, they vibrate on a picosecond time scale or sub-picosecond. So that means 10 to the minus 12. As you will see in the next slide, our simulations, computer simulations for these systems actually capture that. We can do a very good job simulating this fast motion. But then as you go up on the scale of biological systems, it gets, so here we have molecular dynamic simulations going. That's really a stretch. I would say 10 to the minus 6 microseconds. And in cells, inside cells, most things happen on a time scale longer than microsecond, milliseconds typically. Ion channels opening and closing on a millisecond time scale. Assembly of protein complexes such as actin filaments or DNA transformations could be even longer. Protein folding up to seconds, and that's why we can't solve this problem yet. The protein folding problem has not been solved. And then you have, of course, physiological responses on a 100 millisecond to a second. Right? Our conscious response to stimuli is about 500 milliseconds, half a second, which actually is a bit of a, to me, a bit of a mystery, because when you look at hockey players, some of the most McDavids and so on, skilled hockey players or tennis players, they respond, if you were to measure the time of the response to the stimulus, going to the puck, or which is going at 100 miles an hour, or tennis ball, which is served at 150 miles an hour, and they get perfectly return to that serve, it must be much faster tan half a second. I mean, half a second, it's too late to even do anything, it's gone. So, but that maybe is activating some circuits in the brain which normal people like you and me, not professional athletes, don't develop this kind of fast response. After training, whatever. So you can see here cellular events on tens of thousands of seconds. Cell division, typically hours, right, in the lab, would be 6 hours maybe. So when you, life on Earth, 4 billion years, human life, do you know how many seconds do we live on average? Human lifespan? Any guesses? How many seconds is the human lifespan? Trillion, million, billion. About 3.5 billion seconds. When you say it like that, it sounds really short, right? So you have to compare it to nanoseconds, the opposite, 10 to the minus 9, right? That's the nanoscale, nanosecond. Conformational changes in proteins would be in a nanosecond scale, and we live billions of seconds, so 18 orders of magnitude separating these two things. On the other hand, the energy scale is really comparable to physical systems, and not surprisingly, because it's biochemistry. So there's a lot of different bond energies. You can look at the lab, ionic and covalent, the strongest 90 kilocalories per mole. But I want to just point your attention to two things in this table, and you can relate the energy scale to the reaction rate scale. And biochemists and cell biologists usually talk about KD or Ka, right? equilibrium constants, K. I want to mention two things in the context of energy and life. Number one is KT. We live at 37 degrees Celsius, and at that temperature, we have free energy available to all parts of the body at the KT level per degree of freedom, which is basically whatever can move. One type of motion is 1 degree of freedom. Let's say vibrational or torsional, whatever. So what is KT at this level? It's 0.6 kilocalories per mole. In other words, anything that is less than that is noise, doesn't count. Because you live in an ocean of KT, thermally speaking. That's what metabolism brings with it. We cannot live below that. I think you would probably, correct me if I'm wrong, 34 degrees Celsius would be hypothermia that you can come back from, maybe 35, 4. And at 42 Celsius, you have denaturation of proteins and DNA, and that's too high. So a very narrow range of temperatures, normal 37, and that corresponds to 0.6 kilocalories per mole, which is really a very small, so quantum energy level. As I said, anything below it, forget about its noise. On the other hand, biological energy is quantized, and that's a big word, but it's really true. That is, it's not coming in continuum, it's coming in units, very precise energy units, namely ATP, mainly, or GTP, sometimes. We'll talk about this as well, because it's very important. So energy quantization in biology is almost visible to us, because we know that every molecule of ATP or GTP brings with it a quantum of biological energy, which, roughly speaking, is 10 to the minus 20th joules. Joule is Newton times meter, so force times distance, right? So 10 to the minus 20th is what I call, and some other people do as well, a quantum of biological energy. Anything less than that is dismissed as insufficient to do anything, or noise. Anything above it will be 2 ATP, 3 ATP, 4 ATP. I hope it reminds you of what we talked about in terms of energy, Max Planck's energy quantization in physics. It was n plus 1/2 h omega, or h times f. So biology has energy quantization demonstrably in place. Right, that's the biological energy quantum. And it's very, well, I'll come back to it hopefully today, because there's something that I wanted to say more specifically. One thing that might surprise you in this connection is that we have a very high turnover, and that's why it seems that it's a continuum of energy, very high turnover of ATP. It's not that we throw it away. ATP goes into ADP, adenosine diphosphate, from triphosphate, and then gets recycled in the metabolic cycle back to ATP. But the amount of recycling is astounding. It's equal to your weight per day. So every day you recycle that amount of ATP, equal to your own weight. Another interesting thing is the power that we generate as human beings, because metabolism is the necessary condition for being alive. And again, I'll ask you a quick question. Do you have any idea? Well, we know about 2,000 calories per day we eat, and that's the energy that we introduce into the body, which is transformed for mainly maintaining temperature, right? 70% or so is temperature, just to be at 37 Celsius. 70% of all the energy consumed is used for that. The other 30% for moving and doing work, even for digestion, that also costs energy. So the question to you is, what does it mean in terms of, and that may be a question of the exam, 2,000 kilocalories per day. Actually, these are nutritional calories, not physical calories, right? If you convert it into physical, it's 1,000 times that. How would you compare this amount of energy to something physical, not biological? This amount of energy consumption. I'll give you one example. How many light bulbs consume that amount here? Look, here, this much energy. How many light bulbs you think consume the amount of energy we consume on average every day? And of course, some athletes will, at exhaustion, will consume more, but this is the average. What would you think? 1,000 light bulbs or 100, 10? Rating is 100 watts. Nobody thought about this, right? That's why it's so difficult, but I do. Being a physicist, I have a lot of time to think about things like that. It's actually 1. Surprising, right? 1 light bulb is consuming as much energy as you do.
What kind of light bulb?
100 watt rating.
Okay.
So it's more powerful, but not something like industrial strength. So anyway, and a follow-up, which we'll come back to next week, about which is the most energy-intensive organ in the body? Yes, the brain, 25%. So 25 watts going to the brain, which is a very small light bulb, like a night table light bulb lamp. And out of that 25 watts, only about 5, maybe even 3, which is like a flashlight, is going to cognition, including your, algebra, solving problems, calculus and all that. Which means, I just want to say that the brain is amazingly efficient. Amazing. Okay. So I just want to mention one more thing, that the hierarchy of scientific knowledge. So that kind of is important in the context because we started from physics and I told you about zooming into elementary particles. But when you zoom out and you go from physics to chemistry, we just need to know about atoms, right? You build molecules from atoms. You don't need to know too much about quarks and gluons and all that stuff. Never, ever. But then if you zoom further out, if you talk about biochemistry, you only need to know about amino acids, nucleic acids, and phosphates and sugars. That's about it, right? So organic molecules. And if you zoom out further into cell biology, then you just look at proteins and DNA, RNA, and membranes, but that basically ions. Yes. And then you zoom out even further, then you forget about cell biology. You look at tissues and characterizing that's this type of tissue. Right? So we have problems crossing these boundaries, and therefore each of these disciplines develops its own language and develops its own rules. So physics seemingly doesn't exist to cell biology because it's kind of several layers away from it. And as you zoom out, as you zoom out from chemistry, you forget about most of chemistry. You only leave out of chemistry the organic stuff. And then you zoom out of biochemistry into cell biology, you only maintain proteins and so on, and complexes, and so on. So elements and interactions between elements. So you simplify things and you forget that actually at the bottom of it all is quantum blue. All these elements are quantum entities interacting by quantum rules. And we do a lot of, I'm a computational / theoretical physicist, so we do a lot of simulations, and we do the same thing as I described to you in terms of zooming out and using different rules of simulation simply because we don't have large enough computers to do everything in a so-called ab initio from first principles. So these are the scales at which you do actually quantum simulations, nanometer to picoseconds, maybe 10 to the minus 12 seconds, maybe a bit longer, but not much. That's the realm of quantum simulation. And then we use atomistic models, which are classical, but each atom is represented by a ball. stick and ball models. So that goes into almost microseconds and almost micrometers. And then you coarse grain it. In other words, then you replace, you forget about individual atoms. You only see, for example, amino acids, one amino acid, leucine, isoleucine, and so on, as a single entity, right? You don't see what's inside. And then after that you use, if you go into seconds and millimeters, which is basically tissue scale, you forget about even that. You don't see any atoms, you don't see any amino acids, you just see continuum models. And you have continuum of, let's say, solid tissue and blood flow, you may have vasculature in it. So that's how conceptual development occurs on a quantitative scale. And that's also the reason why we don't have such a great knowledge of how to represent biological matter consistently. I think we often, at least in the media, people bow down to science, like science is the new religion, right? We know everything. Well, wait a minute. We really know fragments. Okay. And that's, maybe I'll just give you another little quirky thing. Combinatorial barrier. So I mentioned to you Simon de Laplace, who said that we could predict the fate of the universe, etc. And then we said quantum mechanics says no. Even if there was no quantum mechanics, there is something called the combinatorial barrier, which means that this is the limit to our knowledge, an absolute limit to our knowledge, and that's the number. It's called immense. Elsasser was a mathematician who coined this number, 10 to the power 110. And that means that if you have a set, any set, for example, a set of all musical scores you can think of, or a set of all chess games you can think of, or a set of all chemical molecules, or a set of genomes, or a set of even mutations in a single protein. A single protein may have 500 amino acids, right? Average, 500 amino acids. And you can mutate each amino acid into 19 other amino acids in principle. So if you take, let's say, tubulin, which has 450 amino acids, you can possibly mutate, create a set of mutated tubulins in each of the positions into 19 other amino acids. So that number of possible tubulin mutations far exceeds this number. Why is this important? If somebody tells you that we can predict the future, well, give that one example. We cannot even predict the structures of tubulin with all possible mutations, let alone all proteins. Why is that? Because this number means if you constructed the largest possible computer in the universe, which would be the entire universe being one computer, where each hydrogen atom is one bit of information, carries one bit of information. And this computer performs operations switching bits every picosecond, which is typical atomic scale transition, as I told you earlier. And it worked for the entire history of the universe. That is the number you get. In other words, the entire universe as a single computer working for the age of the universe, which is what, 15 or 16 billion years in picoseconds, that's 10 to the 70th times to the 10 to the 40th, the number of hydrogen atoms. Then that computer, that universe, would not be able to inspect even, let alone manipulate, just inspect the set of tubulin mutations. I mean, combinatorial explosion is amazing. So this is our real limitation. If you think that we can overcome some of the, we'll solve this by brute force. No, we can't. Some things we cannot. And that's, okay. So just to give you the, sort of, to keep us all very modest as human beings. Because we are becoming very arrogant more and more, I think. Yeah, artificial intelligence will solve all the problems. All right, so I mentioned that this is the Schrödinger and Darwin, the two sort of visionaries on the opposite sides of or the aisle, so to speak, in science. So before we get into examples of quantum physics in biology, I also want to mention two aspects which physics and biology kind of disagree on, or use different conditions anyway. In physics, typically we deal with dry matter. So, there is physics of fluids, but most of the experiments in quantum systems are not in fluids, they're in solids or individual particles. And biology is 70% wet. So that's a complication. And we, by the way, we don't understand even how to simulate water as a physical system. Water is one of the most complicated physical structures. Not one molecule, but water in bulk. We can't even make a proper model that predicts the freezing of water at 0 Celsius. So that is the level of complication that we're dealing with. And the second I mentioned to you is the question of temperature. Temperature destroys perfection because, you know, at low temperatures everything freezes and it's nice to, you have snowflakes and you have beautiful pattern. If you warm it up, then there's a lot of noise. But more and more we see that quantum effects can persist even into room temperature or physiological temperatures. So these are the naysayers about quantum biology. Cells are too big, you know, but we saw statistics, quantum statistics doesn't really dismiss big systems. Life is hot, yeah, but you know there are ways of maintaining coherence. Life is wet. That is a problem, but there is one aspect which actually is very specific to living systems, namely water in living cells is not the same water that you can get from the tap. It's a different physical state, actually. It's ordered. Surfaces of hydrophilic surfaces, so surfaces of proteins and DNA are hydrophilic, and they attract water in a very special way because you have exposed charges or polar groups. Then water, you know, have either protons or hydrogens or oxygens, depending on this complementarity of charge, forming a layer, and this layer is organized typically in some kind of a hexagonal structure where dipole moments orient themselves accordingly. So it's not this random, you know, fluctuating fluid water where everything goes, but it's a quasi two-dimensional structure with organization. So that may be why living systems can be coherent still in a water environment. All right, so there's a lot of words here. I just want to say that out of all this list of unsolved problems in biology, the most important to me at least is related to long-range communication and synchronization of biological systems. We don't have really very well-defined means of synchronization across the human body, for example. Yes, we have various systems and we can analyze, you know, action potentials, sending signals from the receptors of tactile receptors or auditory receptors to the brain. And we'll come to this also, how do these signals, which are quite often incredibly subtle, like olfactory bulb signals, single molecule recognition, get amplified to the microscopic level of sensory perception? Yes, this smells awful, but that was only a few molecules. And actually, animals are even better, like dogs, they sniff, you know, various, let's say, contraband and so on. How is this amplified from a definitely quantum molecular level to an organism or organ-wide level? And secondly, how do we synchronize all of these sensory inputs into our coordinated actions with parallel processing taking place at the same time? I talk to you, I wave my hands, I walk around, I look at this, I think about something else, coronavirus, whatever. Right? So all of this is taking place and we can synchronize without again, this master conductor, somebody there, you know, so quantum systems have this property of coherence, which is basically creating a wave function for the entire complex system out of individual components. So that to me is the greatest unsolved problem of biology, synchronization and orchestration, so to speak, of biological systems responses. There are other problems like self-organization, formation of structure, or even evolutionary biology, that is, well, I should say developmental biology. Formation out of embryos, there's no genetic code for the form, it's for the components, then your proteins. Where is this? How? No, too many questions. So, quantum biology, according to Wikipedia, refers to applications of quantum mechanics to biological objects and problems, and usually means non-trivial quantum features. Like trivial quantum features means quantum chemistry. That means that, yeah, of course, biology is chemistry and chemistry is physics. So, by definition, the biological systems are not made of different stuff. They're just made differently, and they, again, as I mentioned to you, metabolism is what makes it special, because you pump it with energy and you transduce energy into biological response. But these are these weird things I mentioned to you earlier that currently when you talk to somebody about quantum biology, superposition, being in two states at the same time. Classical systems don't have it. And it doesn't need to go into psychopathology to be, for example, split personality disorders, right? But we do have, if you think about mindsets or mind states, we definitely can superpose instantaneous thoughts about different things. So you can think about the brain as a quantum system par excellence, because it is able to at least exist in parallel states. Whether it's compartmentalized or not, I will not get into it, but we definitely can be. And one thing, again, time permitting, I'll say a few words about this, which is quite interesting in the context of psychology, speaking of the brain. And one thing I didn't mention in relation to quantum physics. In quantum physics, as opposed to classical, the order of operations matters. That is, if you measure momentum and then you measure spin, it may be a different result, or maybe time and energy versus energy and time. If you reverse the order of measurements, you get different results. It's called non-commutability. These operations do not commute. It's not in the sense of commuting to work. Commuting means changing the order of things. And for sure, in psychology, that is a well-known phenomenon. If I were to ask somebody two different questions, let's say emotionally opposite questions, pointed questions, something maybe about, something that would cause you a sad thought or depression, and something which would make you happy. The order in which you ask these questions will elicit different reactions. So our brain definitely is not a computer. It's not a classical computer. There's something much more profound. So superposition, non-locality, I mentioned briefly also, it's non-locality meaning action at a distance, the spooky action at a distance, being able to perceive distant events. I think even I don't know if this will be on this video, but the CIA had a program, remote viewing. I don't know if you heard about that. Maybe still have it. They trained CIA operatives to perceive events just through the power of the mind that occurred somewhere else on the planet or sometime before, and they had incredible skills, these people, to for example, localize some nuclear weapons storage somewhere else, just by focusing their minds on it. So it's kind of like a spooky action at a distance. Entanglement, yeah, tunneling. Okay, so these are the weird things. Entanglement, tunneling, non-locality, superposition. Absolutely not classical. And so quantum biology has a fairly long history of speculations by actually very respected scientists. And that group of scientists is listed here, including the very early quantum physicists, Niels Bohr, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, I mentioned to you, von Neumann, von Weizsäcker, Elsasser, and Weizsäcker, and Eugene Wigner, Freeman Dyson, who just passed away a week ago, I think, one of the greatest living physicists. He was 97. And he also thought very deeply about biology and consciousness and things like that, and others. And all of them, of course, being physicists, what do you expect? But they believe that quantum mechanics is essential for life, for understanding life. And we're still grappling with this. So, in terms of concrete applications to biological systems of these quantum concepts, I'll tell you about quantum metabolism. And I think this is very important because metabolism is, according to me at least, a defining feature of living systems. Photosynthesis is metabolism by plants. So there is quantum photosynthesis right here. And so these energy-giving processes, if they are quantum at the basis, then all life at least started at the quantum level. Then there is the question of biophotons. There is non-thermal emission. Non-thermal, you remember black body radiation? Every object emits infrared light or electromagnetic radiation, but it's non-thermal. That means beyond, above and beyond the fact that we are 37 degrees Celsius. Infrared cameras, right? So at night, the US Army can see you because you're emitting infrared radiation by being alive. But biophotons is something else. Biophotons typically is the concept of emitting signals by living systems for the purpose of communication with other living systems, or maybe as a byproduct of major events such as cell division. And there was and is interest in differences between normal cells and cancer cells emitting different wavelengths, so you could use it for detection. Energy, so solitons, phonons, conformons, these are terms that designate sort of quantum physics usage in terms of energy transduction within a system without loss or without dissipation, which is one of the major problems because a system is heterogeneous. Biological organisms are heterogeneous. How do you transfer energy without loss or very little loss? Cognition, entanglement, quantum computation, we'll come to it. And Herbert Froehlich was a famous physicist who just missed the Nobel Prize by a whisker. He should have been given this for superconductivity because he came up with the first theory. For some reason, wasn't recognized for it. He was a fellow of the Royal Society at the University of Liverpool and visited our university many times. He had links with the Department of Physics. He came up towards the end of his life, maybe the last 20 years, he worked actually on biological coherence. And he thought and proposed a theory that biological systems maintain dynamical coherence by supporting dipole oscillations in the terahertz region. Terahertz is 10 to the 12th. It's just below visible, and that type of oscillation can be used for recognition. For example, one type of cell can recognize another, and they can assemble if they are the same, or things of this nature. So far we have examples, and we'll go through examples in some more detail. And these are actual famous examples in the last decade or so. Photosynthetic complexes, so chlorophyll in leaves of plants. Some bacteria use photosynthesis. that was definitely demonstrated to be a quantum excitation. So light, just like the photoelectric effect that Einstein explained, it's the same level. Light gets absorbed, electrons get excited, they can then start moving and they can funnel into reaction centers and this energy gets transformed into glucose production typically. The other thing is migratory birds. You must have heard about their incredible ability to find their way from the south to the north in the summer and vice versa before the winter going. And so this mechanism, especially in European robins, was studied by physicists, and it apparently consists of this magnetic field. You know, coming back to spin, I mentioned magnetic field, tiny changes in the magnetic field orientation. It's a very weak effect, get amplified in the brain of this bird by spin transitions. There's a couple of electrons with opposite spins, and they can decouple when the magnetic field changes direction, and that gets amplified by subsequent chemical reactions. So that definitely quantum level, at least a quantum effect at two levels, namely involving spin and secondly involving quantum transitions in organisms such as these birds. I mentioned this, but there are physiological quantum effects that also merit attention. Human vision, and not only human, but mammalian vision, involves photoreception. Rods and cones in the retina get activated by a single photon, a single quantum of electromagnetic radiation, and that causes, again, an electronic cascade with the amplification. And as experiments were performed trying to determine the threshold for activating the visual system, and it's about 2 photons, maybe not 1, but 2 quanta are sufficient to trigger that effect. Another one is the sense of smell, olfaction, and this is a difficult one because typically in terms of activation of receptors in cells, we think about lock and key. The lock and Linus Pauling came up with this with this concept that in biology everything is lock and key. So you have a shape matching, right? I'm looking for a key. Trying, but anyway, there's no lock here. But you get the picture, right? So the key has to have a very specific shape to match into the lock. And that would explain a lot of receptors which get activated by a molecule, hormone receptor, for example. A hormone has to fit into the receptor with its shape. And sometimes if you have mutations, then things go haywire and so on. There's a problem with the sense of smell. Olfactory receptors get activated by molecules which have absolutely nothing in common, no shape similarities, and therefore the idea that was proposed by Luca Turin and collaborators, Marshall Stoneham, and developed as a physical theory is that it's not shape recognition, but it's resonant interaction, vibrations at the same frequency. So the receptor gets activated by a vibrating organic aromatic molecule that has a frequency that corresponds to this one. So that's the aspect of quantum resonance. So the molecule, the aromatic molecule and the receptor have the same frequency, and therefore it's not by shape recognition but by resonant activation. All right, so that's in mitochondria. Getting back to metabolism, there is electron transfer chain which involve electron hopping, and then anesthesia consciousness. We'll come to it next week. Maybe the most interesting part of this course, but a little bit under development. So a lot of people look at this as somewhat speculative. But you have to speculate in science at some point. Otherwise, it's too boring. Yeah, so there's something interesting, just maybe I'll finish in a few minutes in terms of using quantum search algorithms, because again, back to pattern recognition, cell-cell communication, maybe there's something that quantum physics can offer. Quantum search algorithms are very efficient, not like classical where you have to try every combination. You know, if you have a combination lock and you forget the combination, right? Could be very frustrating, right? They have a lot of possibilities and it would take hours and hours. But if you have the quantum ability to do it by quantum, then what you do is you spread the wave function to all the combinations, and it'll basically, the wave function would zero in on the correct. And so you instantaneously find the correct combination. So this is the nature of a quantum search algorithm. And the interesting thing is that, so as you know, DNA has a code based on 4 elements, 4 nucleic acids, RNA too, one is different. And amino acids have 20, so there's 20 amino acids to make a peptide, and peptides make proteins. So quantum search algorithms have different efficiencies. The most efficient, with a single query, allows you to search a database of size 4. Which would be DNA, corresponding to DNA, and with 3 queries you can get 20. So the idea is that, for example, protein folding uses a quantum search algorithm, or DNA folding also uses a different, maybe a faster quantum search algorithm. Maybe there's also speculations that mutations involve quantum transitions. And one of those things is that mutations, a priori, should be random. Why is there a need for a specific mutation? And then when you examine effects of these mutations, for example, in p53 molecule in cancer, it's 50% of cancers have p53, which is mutated. And only 6, it's a very long 500 amino acid protein. And only 6 particular mutations are called hotspots, account for maybe 50% of all cases, maybe 40%. So why these? You know, there's something very strange about it. Why these particular ones? I think my time is up. Is it?
Yep, just
about
exactly.
Exactly now. If you have questions, please go ahead. I hope we will be able to meet. I really worry about that.
I think that we probably will. If you think of an entity the size of the university and how complex it is, even if the decision is made, they'd have to decide on the date. And I'm predicting that March 24th is probably too soon, and it'll be sometime after that. And as long as it's after that, it's really not going to, affect the presentation of the course very much. We just have some interesting questions about how your final presentations will be given, but I'm sure that's solvable.
I'm worried that if our Prime Minister comes down with this, then everybody will say, even the Prime Minister got it, and therefore we have to all go home. But anyway, so that's kind of the entry into the things that we call quantum biology. And next week I'll talk about things which are at an even larger scale, so metabolism and quantum metabolism and quantum cognition.
So it occurs to me that there's a kind of metaphor here that really the decision of going entirely virtual would be based on things very similar to what we've been talking about. It isn't just whether the Prime Minister has it, but whether the number of cases within the university suggests that if we don't all go home, that we'll be overwhelmed, like predicting from the number of cases now what it would be next week if everything stays the same and so on.
Yes.
So it is quite similar to a lot of the things that you've been calculating here.
I'm actually doing it every day. You know, there's a website called worldometer.com, and it's a coronavirus.
Right.
You click on it and you get all the statistics per country. Cases, new cases every day. And I calculate the percentage increase per country, you know, in new cases. And also deaths, so on. Demographics as well. But the main thing is to find out the rate of increase. And for example, China is almost flat now. Whether they report correctly or not, I don't get into it because that's the only information I have. But there's almost nothing in China, so they plateaued and it's just going to, they reached the peak and it's going down. No new cases, virtually. Same in Korea almost, but Italy is exploding, right? Spain, the same thing, is even faster now. So you can predict at least into the next week. But the doubling time, I'm calculating in my head the doubling time. That is the time it takes to double the number of cases. And for Italy is about 3 days, 2 to 3 days. Spain maybe 2, Italy 3. So in a week, 2 times 2 is quadrupling. So Italy is 12,000 cases now, so in a week it should be 50,000. Then it's really serious, right? Canada is 100, but the doubling time is about a week. So it's still pretty slow, I think. So I would say we need about 3 weeks to finish the semester, and then they close down the whole thing.
Yeah, so just thinking about Italy, I mean, they're kind of very graphic depictions of what's going on there. Like, a lot of the patients require ventilation. A lot of physicians never learn how to use a ventilator. So you take a hospital and you have this little pamphlet. This is how a ventilator works. You give a physician who's never seen one before the pamphlet, and they take the pamphlet and go to the place where all these patients are that need ventilating. Go from this little pamphlet to ventilating the patient. So that's what happens when you exceed the capacity of the system. So that's what we'd like to avoid. Italy obviously has reached that point where you have completely untrained people doing things that are life and death kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So we'd like to avoid that. Yeah. So that's but a lot of these decisions are also made on sort of political bases, right? Am I going to be criticized as a leader if I don't decide this? Like, that's more important really than what the country needs, right? It is what are the political ramifications of this going to be? And that's not very predictable either, it was something called swine flu in the US, where the treatment was actually worse than the disease. The disease wasn't very bad, but a lot of people died from the therapy, from the vaccine. There were more deaths from the vaccine than deaths from
Well, we don't have a vaccine for the coronavirus.
swine flu. So the president who made the decision that everybody should get the vaccines suffered politically for deciding that. But I mean, that probably won't happen again. But who can tell? So
one last question: how many of you are following social distancing these days to prevent getting infected? You are conscious of it or not?
So it's simple, really. If you think about going to a restaurant or any public place to eat, people are supposed to be 1 meter apart. Now, in a not very popular restaurant, you probably already reached that. You go in, there's hardly anyone else there. You are 1 meter apart. So it depends on the kind of places that you go. If you're very trendy and go where most Canadians go, then you should stop that, right? But if you have very different tastes from most people and go to places that are not very popular with Canadians generally, you're probably already practicing safe eating. So, yeah, and like in this course, if rather than saying all courses in the university are going to go virtual, if they say, no, you just have to keep 1 meter distance.
Yeah.
Well, we could easily do that, right? So we could do that in a few seconds, and we'd be 1 meter apart, and that would be fine.
Well, let's hope for the best.
Yeah, so there are many ways that this could turn out, and it could be nuanced and titratable, or it could just be blanket that in the entire university we're going virtual.
So I got a message from the dean that at least tomorrow and Monday will be the regular in medicine. The regular
Yes.
process, right?
Yes. So everybody has to be ready by Monday or by the end of the day on Monday to go virtual. That doesn't mean that we will do it then, but
Should be
yeah.
prepared. So we have a copy of my presentation. Maybe we can go through Skype or something.
Yeah. So I mean, what we could easily do, I don't know how many of you used like Google Hangout and that sort of thing, but
Yeah, Skype.
with our numbers, there are so many ways to do it. So we obviously can stay in
Screen
contact.
sharing.
Yeah. And with Rich Man, Poor Man on April the 2nd, or the 4th, whatever it is, it's also interesting that it's not just a matter of how many people get tickets. They may decide that all gatherings of larger than 100 people can't be held, right? I mean, that's another thing that the university could decide. So, anyway.